Hello and welcome to A Slice of Medieval. Today we have a very special guest in Max Adams, who has written more than a dozen books on early medieval history and archaeology, on trees, woodlands and wood, alongside biography and a novel, The Ambulist. Max is an archaeologist, historian and traveller, the author of numerous articles and journal papers. After several years as Director of Archaeological Services at Durham University, he went to live in a 40-acre woodland in County Durham for 3 years. He combines writing with travel and managing 2 young woodlands in the northeast of England. He's also co-director of research of the Bernician Studies Group. His latest works are 2 early medieval histories spanning the centuries during which England and the English state were being formed by imaginative, powerful kings, from Oswald and Edwin to Athelbald and Offa, the Mercian Chronicles and Northumbria AD 367 to 867. And today he is here to talk to us about Mercia, its history, and the great king Offa. Welcome, Max.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's nice to be here. Or there, or wherever we are on the somewhere.
Nice to be anywhere, really.
Yeah, well, me and you were up north. Derek's down south somewhere, so we've got the nice air.
Not complaining.
No. So I suppose the first question is, where is Mercia? And were the Mercians Angles or Saxons?
Yeah, those are usually the 2 questions I pass on. Where was Mercia? Wouldn't we all like to know? Mercia, of course, the name means the border people, the border dwellers. And we traditionally think of that meaning the Anglo-Welsh border. I'm by no means certain that's what it means. The core land of the later Mercian kings is in the area around Lichfield and Tamworth, northwest Midlands. And yet Mercian kings by the 8th century, or for the whole of the 8th century, really, their heyday, ruled the lands. If you take a square and you have the top left-hand corner of the square at Chester on the River's Dee, London in the bottom right-hand corner, the Severn Estuary in the bottom left-hand corner, and the River Humber in the top right-hand corner, you've got a pretty good idea of how far the reach of Mercian kings ran. Whether that's the same as what is Mercia is a whole other point. We know that Mercia's northern marcher lands with Northumbria lay probably along the River Don rather than the River Trent. There were certainly Mercians living north of the River Trent. The fenlands that separate Lincolnshire from East Anglia were certainly the marcher lands on the eastern side. But the early Mercian kings didn't control London. And in fact, early Mercia was a landlocked state. And it was necessary for them to expand their state to include London so that they had access to the continent. So there is no one Mercia, I suppose, but the headlands of the River Trent, I suppose, are their core lands. Were they Anglians? This may sound fatuous. You'd have to ask them. I don't know. I don't know that we know what people thought of themselves in ethnic terms. If they did think in ethnic terms, they probably did think Anglians, although they probably also had a pretty woolly idea of what Anglians meant in historical terms. They had sort of ancestral stories about people coming over from the continent. If you actually tested the blood or did the DNA of Mercians living in the 8th century, you'd find, like us, that they were hybrids of people from north, south, east, to west, and overseas. We're a mongrel race, and so were they. My suspicion is that people identified themselves in a more local way. So the people on the west side of the fens in so-called Middle Anglia would probably have called themselves the people of the Willer, the River Willow, or the Gera, people around what's now Peterborough, the Spalder in Spalding, and various other names. And in the west, you would find the Huiche, roughly the sort of headlands or the headwaters of the River Severn and the Vale of Gloucester, the Magonset, the Riocanset, people who emerged out of the end of the Roman period. But I suspect people identified themselves on a pretty local basis. People travelled, of course, and people moved around, but I think people felt a very strong sense of regional identity. And sometimes we know people identified themselves by who they weren't. They definitely weren't Wessex, and they definitely weren't Northumbrians or East Anglians. That's easier to say. I think people do. People have multiple identities. You might say, Sharon, that you're Yorkshire. I might say I'm a European, or English, or British, or any number of things. Identity is fraught and often loaded with nationalist overtones that I think serious historians are probably, in some respects, best avoiding.
I think you're right. When you look at it, I mean, even now, like I live literally over the river from Gainsborough, which would have been the Gainey in the time of Mercia, wouldn't it? That's a heck of a long way from the Whicker or even Spalding. The idea of them thinking that they share an identity because they're all in Mercia is just like we do now because we're all in England or we're all in Britain or we're all in Europe. There's still the mixed identities within that identity. That's
right. Of course, one also has to bear in mind how important lordship was in identity. I suspect, I can't prove this and we'll never know, that if you met somebody on an old Roman road in the 8th century, the first thing you would ask them to identify themselves was not what their name was or where they came from, but who their lord was. That's the most important relationship in understanding your relations with the outside world. And they would have known which king was overlord over their people at which particular time. These things fluctuate. The striking thing about Mercia, the key thing about Mercia, which is why it's so extraordinary that it's been neglected for so long, is that by the middle of the 8th century, Mercian royal administrators were beginning to tie Mercians together with a scheme for identifying where they lived and of what use they were to the king. And that begins to make Mercia much more coherent in an administrative sense. And you see that administrative cohesion coming through into the Viking period with the 5 boroughs and the Danelaw, and then right into medieval England. So there's a big change happening in Mercia in the 8th century. When Mercia rises in the 7th century, it was a disparate group of peoples over whom great warlords were able to claim overlordship. But by the middle of the 8th century, you can identify elements of what we would call a state. People may not like belonging to a state, but for taxation and administrative and judicial purposes, they absolutely do. Mercia is fascinating from that point of view. We see that transition from tribal kingdoms to statehood.
So this area that we're calling Mercia, that has a mixed identity and all sorts of problems, how do we get that kingdom arising? You mentioned in the 7th century, given that it's kind of squeezed in with other areas around it. How did they actually manage to achieve that level of cohesion?
It's a very good question. Well, I suppose the most obvious answer on one level is dynastic stability. So from the 630s up until the middle of the 8th century, we have a single dynasty within which various people are competing for control. The first Mercian king who becomes famous, as it were, a sort of celebrity king, is King Penda. He's important because he kills various Northumbrian kings and therefore comes to the notice of Bede, and is a pagan whose sons convert to Christianity. So he's an important figure. His sons rule after him, 3 of them, and their sons after them, 2 of them, and then distant collateral members of the same family. So dynastic stability is key. Royal legitimacy is key in Anglo-Saxon kingship. It's not hereditary. Accession is by acclamation. You could call it election, but it's a very small electorate. It's by acclamation of the people whose words count. The second thing to say about Mercia is that although it looks disparate, we have the people of Lindsey in Lincolnshire, we have the Middle Anglians of what we would now call, the Western Fen Edge, Leicester and Bedfordshire and Northamptonshire. We have the Corlands around Lichfield and Tamworth at the headwaters of the Trent. Then we have the Anglo-Welsh border, and then we have the land of the Huiche down along the Severn and the Avon. So it looks very disparate. It's tied together because somewhere in Mercian history there's a genius. There may have been 3 or 4 geniuses. Can't put names to them. One of them figured out, or maybe several of them figured out, a truth about the British landscape that the Romans figured out very, very quickly when they invaded in the 1st century. One is that England's navigable rivers that penetrate from the east, northwest, southwest and southeast have a very strong geographical logic to them. All the rivers that drain north and east into the Wash, the North Sea, and the English Channel, their headwaters run along a line that separates them from the rivers that drain south and west and northwest. And that line, the Romans drew a line along there, probably along an ancient Iron Age road, and built a road along it and called it Watling Street. That's England's continental divide. Deliberately, it connects the navigable River Dee with the navigable River Thames at London. There's logic here. And then there's another line that runs from the northeast to the southwest, and the Romans drew a line along that pretty straight and called it the Fosse Way and built a road there. And that road connects the navigable rivers of the east, the Trent, the Witham, really important rivers, with the southwest. So in order for Mercians to get access to the navigable rivers that led towards the trade routes, Scandinavia, Frisia, and Francia, they needed control of these navigable rivers. So they, as it were, rediscovered the Roman road system that connects all the navigable headwaters. The places you can get to along all the major rivers are connected by Roman roads. That's the logic of Roman Britain. The kings of Wessex, who don't have such navigable rivers, never figured this out. The Northumbrians, who don't have such great navigable rivers by and large, although of course York is a great exception, didn't quite figure this out, but the Mercians did. Somebody in Mercia figured this out, and that gives them not only the economic ability to connect the huge mineral resources of the West, we're talking lead and silver and copper and tin and particularly salt, with markets in the East. So that's a massive benefit for Mercians. They can make money instead of making war. They figure that out. If you look at the incidents of warfare in the late 7th century, there are lots of battles. How violent the country is, I don't know, but there are plenty of battles. 8th century, not many. Certainly not in Mercia. They figured out much, much better ways of making money than bashing people on the head and stealing their treasure. They will do that if they need to. But they figured out how to make money out of this landscape. And the tools they use are tools of royal administration. And they use the network of Christian communities that have set themselves up, funnily enough, all along the navigable rivers. And it's the Mercian monasteries that are the powerhouse of an economic and probably political revolution in the 8th century. I mean, there's a long, complicated story to tell about how Mercian kings do this, but in essence, that's it. They rediscovered the realities of how connected Roman Britain was.
You mentioned salt. Salt's been overlooked a bit, hasn't it, until fairly recently? Because
not by
it's
me.
such a... Not by you, no.
No, it has. I've just spent 3 years walking 1,000 miles through the English counties, looking through the eyes of the doomsday surveyors of the 11th century. Almost the key place in the entire English landscape is Droitwich. And people go, where?
Yes.
People in Droitwich will go, aha, somebody's finally noticed that we're the most important place in England. Droitwich is the longest lasting, most successful industrial base that we have in this country. Why Droitwich? Well, there are brine springs in Cheshire, of course. You can win salt from the sea. I won't say it's easy, but you can do it. The salt springs that occur naturally at the surface in Droitwich occur at a concentration 10 times that of seawater. I mean, go figure the economics of that. You're using 1/10 of the fuel to make salt, and Droitwich is on a navigable river and a Roman road network. Ka-ching. By doomsday, 40 or 50 great lords spread across the Western Midlands and the South have rights to salt houses in Droitwich. It was always a royal perquisite, and kings sell those rights. They let them out, particularly in concessions to the bishops of Worcester, who are by far the most powerful spiritual landlords, as it were, in Mercia. And of course, salt is used for everything. It's used as a trading commodities. It's so valuable. It flavors food. It preserves food. It's used in tanning. It's massively important. And the ability to process it cheaper than anybody else is a hugely important Mercian asset. Well, it was a Huichian asset, and before that it was a British asset and a Roman asset. But yeah, Droitwich is key place, and not for nothing is it on the 18th century canal network for exactly the same reasons. And of course, you've got the lead of the Peak District, you've got copper and gold and silver in the Welsh hills, and you've got Cotswold sheep, and you've got the heavy soils of the Midlands, which they're just beginning to learn how to plough with big, heavy ploughs. So Mercia is ideally poised for an economic revolution once it's connected via the Thames with the continent. And there are some very, very clever people hanging around who make it happen. Now, are they Mercian kings? Are the Mercian kings particularly brilliant? One of them certainly is. I mean, brilliant on the level of Alfred, brilliant.
Yeah, yeah,
Warlords who are statesmen, who are thinkers, who are philosopher kings, if you like,
yeah.
clever people. Who are the other people? Well, some of the abbots and abbesses are clearly very, very canny economically. They're well connected with Europe. They speak an international language. We know that Mercian abbesses have trading vessels. We know that some of the most successful settlements in Mercia are along the navigable rivers, and they're presided over by powerful abbots and abbesses. Places like Peterborough, fantastically powerful, wealthy establishment. Cookham on the Thames, which was owned at various points by King Offa's queen. Archaeologists have been excavating these settlements for a while now, and they're certainly religious, spiritual communities. But of course, because they own their land in perpetuity, as it were, freehold from the Almighty, they're able to invest very, very heavily in capital and labour. And so they don't just have churches and cemeteries and workshops. They're also industrially producing leather working, bone working, books, of course, they're producing for exchange and profit, wool. They're busy places, these Mercian monasteries. Northumbrian monasteries and Wessex monasteries are too, but the Mercian monasteries are real standouts economically. And then you've got the bishops, and you've probably got some secular lords. We begin to get some of their names because they come through in the charters. Mercia is very poor in narrative history, very, very rich in charters and archaeology, and place names. Place names are the really hot ticket in the last sort of 20 years for understanding how the Mercian state is put together. Royal administrators, whoever these people are, bishops of Worcester, senior clerics, senior secular lords, probably also traders and moneyers who are in the king's circle. Sometimes the king's wife is a key figure in this. These people are working out how to solve an essential dilemma that they've got. Their secular lords fight to expand the kingdom and to defend it. Those lords are rewarded, if successful and if they survive, with land on which to raise a family of new warriors and warlords. And in battle, they win glory and booty and treasure. But with less warfare, they see their spiritual cousins, almost literally cousins, because the spiritual, the abbots and abbesses are drawn from the same cultural elite, same nobility. They see these people having their cake and eat it. The monasteries are tax-free, freehold gifts from the king, accumulated over many decades from the middle of the 7th century. By the early 8th century, monasteries are very wealthy. They don't pay tax. They don't have to give their land back when the abbot or abbess dies. They're held in perpetuity. And the secular lords are beginning to think, hang on a second, why don't we get a chunk of this pie? So this process is called booking land. And it's a pretty good deal, frankly. Secular lords only enjoy those rights while they're alive. Once they're dead, the leasehold lapses. So this process of giving land to the monasteries is called booking, and it's done in writing. Key thing, of course, these ecclesiastics can write, so they can write stuff down. So this gives them a tremendous advantage. Sometime in the 720s, we for the first time see charters booking land. They place the charter, in the case of monasteries, on the altar of the church, and with it a sod or turf of the land. The actual piece of the earth is placed on the altar. That's the title deed. In case you can't read, there's the earth. Anyway, the secular lords want to know why they can't book land in perpetuity so that their children will be able to inherit it. And that begins to happen in the early 8th century in Mercia. And that trend increases, of course, very, very rapidly. Everybody wants to join in that. By the 740s, this creates a problem. First of all, the king has much less land to give away now, because kings have been giving away land hand over fist for 100 years now. And second of all, there's this tension between warlords whose service to the king is military service, and the monasteries who do not owe military service. And the secular lords don't like this tax situation. It's not favourable to them. So that they start challenging it, and the church fights back, and it all comes to a head at a series of synods in the 740s, over which archbishops and bishops and the king preside, and they have to sort out a very, very delicate piece of politics. And it's fairly familiar politics in the 21st century. It's about the divvying up of rights. It's about who puts kings in power, who keeps them there, who's making the money, who's not getting their fair share. And one of the techniques they use to do that is, first of all, they want the secular lords to build a defensive enclosure for the king. They want those lords to make sure the roads are kept open and in good shape. They want the lords to make sure that the bridges across rivers are kept open. In other words, in return for land, they're giving service to the Mercian state in the person of the king. This is really revolutionary. Okay, they call it the common burdens, and it's about public service.
Do they actually keep the roads safe and repaired? Because if they do, can we actually transport them to here and now?
Well, isn't it a good question? Whose job is it to keep the roads open? Whose job is it to clean up the litter? Well, we have laws that say whose job it is, but there's always a constant set of tensions. Yeah, of course, we'll fix the potholes, but you need to give us more money. That money must come from the public purse. Well, no, that should come from local taxation. It's the same issue. The answer is, yeah, we know they do keep the roads up. I mean, we know for various reasons that Mercian kings could get organized labor on a very, very large scale. And I know we'll talk about that. I mean, one of the hugely impressive achievements of the Mercians is to put a bridge across the River Trent, low down on the borders between Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. The Trent is a very big, fast, dangerous, deep, dynamic river. Lethal. Don't fall in the River Trent when it's in Spain. They build a bridge across it at a place called Cromwell near Newark. And the remains of that bridge were discovered in the 19th century. The wooden piers that held it on the bottom were discovered. And because it was a danger to navigation, they blew it up. Fortunately, some of the bits of timber were retrieved, and they've been radiocarbon dated. So we can blame that bridge on someone during the reign of King Athelbald. Wow. Athelbald is your man. Believe me, it all happens in the reign of King Athelbald. And your listeners might not know this, but King Athelbald comes to the throne of Mercia in 716. He reigns for longer than any English king before Henry III. 41 years. How much can a king do in 41 years? Immediately followed by King Offa, 39 years. I mean, is there any wonder that Mercia becomes so stable across that century that it is able to invent the tools that create the English medieval state, that is so sophisticated, so connected? I mean, clearly the reasons why people want to conquer England are because the Mercian state is so successful. And you go forward a few hundred years and you ask how William I was able to commission and produce the Domesday Survey in 7 months. And the answer is because that stuff was already known, because the Anglo-Saxon state was so sophisticated. The origins of that Anglo-Saxon state, in a sense, lie in the ecclesiastical revolution of the Age of Bede, the gens Anglorum, the whole English people and universal church. It's Athelbald particularly, and then King Offa, who really make this happen, or foster a group of people of entrepreneurial, brilliant-minded, as it were, civil servants, who we don't see again really until the Tudors, who also gather this group of highly talented, Alfred a little bit. But yeah, there's something very special about these Mercian kings and the people around them, sharp people.
Yeah.
So I suppose the other question is, who were Mercians' greatest rivals?
After a battle on the River Trent in 679, no Northumbrian army ever again attempted to take Mercia. And the litmus test of that is Lindsey, the old ancient kingdom of Lindsey, what we would think of as Lincolnshire, more or less. Northumbrians and Mercians both wanted Lindsey, and Northumbrian kings certainly had economic and social and political and religious interests in Lindsey right through the 8th century, but they never again possessed it. It was always Mercian after 679, so that's a good marker. Mercian kings had enemies in East Anglia, but they were never seriously going to threaten the Mercian state, rather the other way round. Same in Wales, lots of raiding from Wales, lots of trouble, but no Welsh king was going to conquer Mercia. And it's not until the 9th century that West Saxon kings produce a dynasty stable enough to threaten, by then, a weakening Mercian dynasty. The first man who does that is King Alfred's forebear, King Egbert, who has been an exile in fear of life from the Mercian kings in the court of Charlemagne. But yeah, essentially, the Mercians are unchallengeable for 100 years. Very impressive.
And apart from the organization of the state and so on, what you're saying really is that if you have that kind of dynastic stability and the longevity of kings, then that provides the environment in which you can be organized and and powerful and economically strong.
Yeah, I mean, there is a risk, of course. Take Northumbria in the 8th century. After Bede, Northumbrian history loses its narrative focus. We get notices of kings. We can sort of reconstruct the king lists. But in the time that Offa and Ethelbald are ruling in Mercia, there are 11 kings in Northumbria.
Mm.
And because we don't have a narrative history for Northumbria, the temptation is to think that Northumbria is riven with dynastic conflict and therefore in a state of anarchy. Well, they don't actually join up one-to-one like that. We know there's dynastic instability in Northumbria in a sense. And because of the lack of narrative history, it's tempting to think that Northumbria has literally lost its power. Well, that of course, is not true. Its focus is more northerly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if they're under pressure from the north.
Yeah, but I mean, essentially, all the way from the River Humber to the rivers Forth and Clyde, essentially is within an English cultural milieu.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to overstate that. Linguistically, that's the case, and the place names are fundamentally English. Now, that's not to say that all the people living north of the Anglo-Scottish border are Northumbrians, but Northumbrian cultural influence particularly is very, very strong in what we now think of as southern Scotland. Again, I don't want to overplay that. It's a much more complicated story for another book. But one thing is striking: the evidence of coinage is a very dispassionate testimony to this period. And if we look at Northumbrian coins, we can take a late 7th century king like King Aldfrith, reigned for 25 years. Bede writes about him. He's not a warrior king. He's a scholar. He's a sapientissimus, sapient. He's a wise man, a sort of religious philosopher king. And you can trace in him and his successors a sort of decline of political ambition in Mercia for sure. But if you look at Aldfrith's coins, we only have 34 of them, but numismatists know how to calculate from the coins they have got how many coins there were. And Aldfrith's coins, when analysed, show that Aldfrith's silver coinage was a currency of about 2 million pennies. That is not insignificant. That's not anarchy. When we find those coins in Mercia, we find them across, well, really East Yorkshire, York, and there's no doubt that they would have turned up in Frisia, where they would have been reminted. And right through the 8th century, Northumbrian kings are producing significant economic currency. So the political instability is not necessarily economic weakness. So we have to be really careful about what we're looking at. Mercian kings do raid the north, but Northumbrian kings don't raid Mercia significantly.
You've kind of told us already that although Offa gets the Hollywood name, his predecessor perhaps deserves a bit more credit than cultural history in the UK has given him. And you've sort of demonstrated this by everything you've said. If you ask somebody anything at all, probably the only Mercian king they might have heard of is probably Offa. Whereas, the history of the period he's only a part of it. So how great was he?
If only they'd called it Ethelbald's Dyke. I mean, the fact is, of course, it's called Offa's Dyke, and it has been called Offa's Dyke since the days of King Alfred. The extraordinary thing about Offa's Dyke is we still don't know when it was built, because despite the very large number of holes that archaeologists like me have dug into it, we've never produced a coin or any date. However, Offa's Dyke will be dated in the fullness of time, because we now have techniques of dating buried soil. So we will get there in the end. How great was King Offa? Well, he's a mighty king. Is he mightier than his predecessor? No. I mean, Ethelbald and Offa are both very mighty kings, very powerful. They're kings of sophisticated political establishments. The economy of Mercia goes up and down more or less with the price of silver throughout the 8th century. And certainly after the sort of 740s, there is an economic decline pan-Europe before the silver supply gets going again. There are all sorts of historical reasons for that. Of course, in the late 8th century, you have the rise of the Frankish kings, particularly the Carolingian dynasty, Charles Martel and then Charlemagne, who are mighty kings on a European scale. King Offa is certainly a mighty king. One of the reasons he's more famous than Ethelbald is that Athelbald seems to break the cardinal rule of an early medieval tribal king. He doesn't marry. He produces no legitimate heirs. Must have had children because we know he's fornicating nuns. We're told that he's fornicating. I mean, these are nuns who are part of the nobility. They're part of the elite. They may well be nuns, not necessarily more or less spiritual than any other nuns, but they may be nuns because they don't want to get married. They don't want to bear children. They don't want to be part of that whole lady with the mead cup scenario and potentially meet a violent end or whatever. And they might be intellectuals. They might be, they will be literate. Anyway, we know that Athelbald is partial to a nun, whether it's a nun or lots of nuns, we don't know. But he doesn't produce a legitimate heir, refuses to marry, and he must have been under huge pressure from his bishops and the Archbishop of Canterbury to marry. And when he dies, that's it. The Ethelbald line dies with him. Offa, on the other hand, is only too well aware of his dynastic obligations. He has children, lots of them, mostly girls, one legitimate eldest son, Edgefrith, who becomes his heir. Both his son and his daughters are brought into the royal council, I think, under the influence of Offa's wife, Kynethrith. Most interesting woman, the only Anglo-Saxon queen to have her own coinage. She has her own coinage minted. Well, that's power for you. That's agency. She has huge agency. She has a vast portfolio of estates, including the valuable monastery at Cookham. So she's a powerful woman. She's clearly part of the Royal Administrative Council. She's part of the government, clearly very influential. And this may, of course, be the time at which the poem Beowulf, as we know it, was written down, probably at Offa's court, in which case the role of Kynethrith is rather interesting. If you look at the royal women in Beowulf, the ladies of the mead cup, the prophetesses, the women who lay the sword in their husband's lap if they don't think he's being active enough in defending them. So he's building a dynasty, Offa. Absolutely no question about it. Over 39 years, he's building a dynasty, such that he persuades the Pope to let him have his own archbishop at Lichfield, a third archbishop after York and Canterbury, so that archbishop can anoint his son as his formal heir. There's a lot of really good dynastic politics going on. And all seems to be set up for Mercia to remain the most powerful kingdom in England, except, of course, that the fates intervene. When King Offa dies in 796, his widow is still present and a great force for nature. His son is certainly old enough to succeed, is elected by acclamation, and he's dead within a year. Such are the fates.
Yeah.
And we know political dynasts of our own time who want their children to, who want to organise the succession in their favour. Once you're gone, you're gone.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not to say that Mercia collapses into a state of anarchy. It doesn't. Nevertheless, that dynasty comes to an end, as it were, as the great age of Mercian kings. Yeah.
So, did he build the dike?
Well, I don't think we have any reason to think that Offa didn't cause the dike to be constructed. Of course, there is another dike, Watts Dyke, which looks as if it might be a precursor, a sort of test piece. It runs parallel with the north part of Offa's Dyke to the east, but we've now got a date from that, and that's 9th century. Okay. It doesn't belong to the age of Offa or Athelbald. However inconvenient that might be for historians, it doesn't matter. Okay, Offa's Dyke. Well, those of you who've walked it know it's an impressive piece of construction. It doesn't run all the way along the Anglo-Welsh border. It really starts most seriously after Hereford. Below Hereford, the boundary is really the River Wye. It doesn't extend all the way to the mouth of the River Dee, and it's a brilliant piece of surveying. I mean, highly, highly impressive piece of surveying and engineering. I think the original Offa's Dyke is laid out on a concept which joins the southernmost point on the River Dee with the northernmost point on the River Severn. And there's a more or less dead straight, I say dead straight, not dead straight, a more or less straight north-south line between the two. I think that's probably the key to understanding the thinking process behind it. It's not defensive in the sense of we're going to build a wall and they're going to pay for it to keep people out. In part, it's designed to help control the activities of people raiding across the border through the valleys that connect England and Wales. It's at its strongest where those narrow valleys go through. It's not the boundary of Mercia either. There are Mercian settlements on the west side and there are Welsh-speaking settlements on the east side. Think of it really as a zone of control. It certainly faces Wales. It's performative. People on the west are supposed to know that they have the fist of King Offa placed against them. Thou shalt not. It's not like Hadrian's Wall. There are no fortifications or on the dike. However, we do know from place name evidence in particular that there are points along that wall on either side which show that it was a zone of control. And almost certainly the great secular lords of that landscape were obliged, in return for holding their land, their estates, to be watchers. There are place names that have elements like Wardine in them, the watcher of the marches, those sorts of place names appear. And there are various forts called, like Nuclas is a key one, which clearly has high visual integrity with the wall. It's certainly designed in part to stop cross-river raiding. Who built it? Who actually built it? I suspect forced labor. I mean, that's also part of the performance. Well, I'm going to have a wall built, but you're going to build it. Okay. And in the sweat of your labor, you look on these works, ye mighty, and despair. These are my pyramids. This is my monument. It's still an extraordinary thing. There's nothing like it anywhere. But we know that the 8th century is an age of earthwork construction. Lots of other dikes around. And if you look at the plot of all the great dikes, Grimsditch, Wansdyke, and all those things, the dikes of North Yorkshire, nobody's ever really pointed out the fact that they're all around the edges of Mercia. Some of them may be much older and some of them may be younger, but they're all around the edges of Mercia. There aren't any dikes inside Mercia.
That's what I was wondering. Is it part of a larger defensive process to protect Mercia?
It's not defensive. People look at earthworks and castles and say defensive. They're all about expressions of power in the landscape. You look at the Motte and Bailey castles.
Yes.
They have a defensive purpose, yes, but actually it's an expression of power. It's an expression of privacy. It's an expression of power to force labor to do those works for you. Of course, in Mercia's case, it's part of the common burdens. It's public service.
Yes.
It's like, it's conscripted labor, or it's prisoners of war, or whatever. Mercia doesn't need defending in that sense. Mercian Birks and the Mercians have Birks or Birks long before Alfred invents them, a century before Alfred. They're building these things, but essentially settlements in the early medieval period are not defended. We don't have town walls, not at that period. They don't need it. Even Alfred's Birks, and some of them are built inside Iron Age hill forts. Even the Iron Age hill forts are more performative than defensive. They're defensible. But then the real defences are where roads cross rivers. Those are the points. And it's conspicuous that that's where the majority of early medieval battle sites are, where Roman roads cross rivers. We'll meet you there, and whoever holds the day holds the day. I mean, you don't need a defensive line along the River Trent, for goodness sake, or the River Thames. I mean, in the Second World War, the Thames was called Red Stop Line. They mustn't cross the Thames.
Yes.
But actually, the way you defend is you defend in depth, and you defend by the power of the people whose job it is to watch the roads. It's the people who owe obligation to you. They're your defense. Of course, in the end, those people might turn against you. Even Athelbald, the greatest, I think, king of the 8th century, in the end, he's murdered by a member of his bodyguard. Well, I mean, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. We don't know why. Whether it's because he's old and decrepit and he's no longer functioning properly and just has to be got rid of. People in power become a liability if they look weak.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying that there's any reflection on modern politics, but there comes a point at which people in power begin to look weak.
Well, I remember they say the same about Edward III, don't they? He reigned for 50 years, and they were like, those last 10 years, he really should have died about 10 years earlier. And then those last, years where he was losing it a bit, they wouldn't have happened and tarnished his memory.
Yeah, if the king's authority goes, you have to dispatch them. Somebody has to do it. So I mean, those are the brutal realities of the mafia politics. It's the playbook of the early medieval period. It's the playbook, isn't it? It's the playbook. It's nothing changes.
No. Was Offa related to Athelbald, or was he?
Very distantly. Yeah, they're sort of second cousins, twice removed type thing. They
Yeah,
both hark back to the dynasty of King Penda's
right.
father.
Yeah.
The Eiklings, they're all Eiklings. And in order to be a legitimate king of Mercia, you have to be from that dynasty, unless you've got a bigger warband than them.
So it wasn't primogeniture, eldest son succeeds father, but it was more you had to be. Was it? I mean, the Scots had this idea where the oldest male relative became the king. So they started killing off each other to make themselves the oldest. Was that the same with Mercia, or?
Yeah, well, yeah, bearing in mind the genealogies that we have left to us they've already had redactions, okay? The awkward people are either placed in monasteries to keep them out of the way, or if they don't want to be part of that world, they become abbots and abbesses and bishops. You know, in 8th century Northumbria, the Archbishop of York is the king's brother. That keeps him happy where he is, and he's no threat to the king.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the key things about tribal lordship in 7th, 8th century England is people who've had their head tonsured and thereby symbolically become prematurely bald, join the church, are ineligible to be kings. They can, of course, grow their hair again. And it happens. But there are many kings who are forcibly tonsured and sent to monasteries. And sometimes they come back out again, and sometimes they don't. So, you know, the kingship is competitive. But, you know, in the end, of course, it's realpolitik that says who's going to be. If you've got as in Northumbria, you have quite a few kings who have sons who, when their fathers die, they're only 10. Well, either you get a sort of regent figure or there's trouble. And usually they got rid of. There are lots of examples of young men who might be king when they're older, just not old enough. And yeah, they'll be dispatched, or they're put in a monastery, or they go abroad and I mean, Adelbald is an exile in his youth. He's clearly a threat to the previous kings of Mercia. He goes into exile in East Anglia. And I mean, we hear a fascinating story about Athelbald. It's the only real story we hear about him because he turns up in the life of St. Guthlac, the great Mercian saint who has a biography written of him, the Saint of Crowland, who's a very powerful hermit in the Western Fens. And East Anglia would like him to be their holy man, and the Mercian kings want him to be their holy man. And Ethelwald goes to him in the marshes and seeks solace from him and comfort and a certain amount of wisdom. So at some point, Julie, Ethelbald asks him what his future will be. He's a great holy man. He can see the future, of course, you know, with a few potions and magic mushrooms and so on, and a bit of malnutrition. He can see the future. And project these things. And he says to Ethelbald, "Fear not. You know, you are a righteous a godly young prince. You will in turn be king." And he makes a prediction, and of course the prediction comes true, and that gives Ethelbald huge kudos when he competes for the kingship. He may not be the first in line, but he is legitimized by a great Mercian saint of the royal line. That's heap big magic. Whereas I think Offa just has a big sword.
Yeah. But didn't Offa, I mean, I seem to remember a horrible histories or something. My son telling me about Offa offering one of his daughters to Charlemagne, or offering to marry one of Charlemagne's daughters, something like that.
This is a great story, yeah. And again, it absolutely reeks of modern politics. Charlemagne recognizes Offa as a great king. Charlemagne is a greater king, immensely powerful. His reach spreads over much of what we would call Western Europe. He's an immensely powerful man. He brings us a whole Carolingian Renaissance. He handpicks a Northumbrian scholar, Alcuin, to come to his court and be his sort of great intellectual force and historian and letter writer. You know, he recognizes Offa as a great king. He is very happy for Frankish traders to trade with Mercian traders, above all because of English textiles. They're the great export. English textiles, English cloaks are very highly prized on the continent. Charlemagne has lots of children, and he suggests very magnanimously that he might allow his eldest son to marry King Offa's eldest daughter. Now, there's no question in the way these things work that the eldest son of the greatest king is the higher ranking member of this deal. Okay. However powerful Offa is, he's not Charlemagne, and however highly ranking his daughter is, she's not his eldest son. King Offa agrees, but in the way these things work, that makes Charlemagne King Offa's overlord. That's the nature of the relationship. You marry my son, your daughter will bear his children, but those children are under me. And King Offa readily agrees to this and says, oh yeah, well, as part of this deal, my eldest son can marry your eldest daughter. Communications shut down. Starlink closes, the comms go down, the ambassadors have recalled, there's a trade embargo across the channel, nothing moves.
Wow.
Cut off, absolutely cut off. He's committed the most enormous diplomatic faux pas, and Charlemagne just cuts him off. And then people like Alcuin and the king's treasurer, who happens to be the abbot of Saint-Gervais on the coast, who's a customs officer, these people are running around in panic because the two leaders who've fallen out have to be brought back to the table together. It's a diplomatic disaster for everybody. So they scurry around and try and fix up a deal. And in the end, a deal is done. And just before Offa's death, Charlemagne says, well, okay, your traders can trade again, but I don't want any funny business. I don't want these clerics coming over and pretending they're clerics, but actually they're traders. I want, escaping the tolls and the taxes and so on. I want it straight. And by the way, send me some of those cloaks you used to send us because they're really nice, but not the last lot you sent us because they're too short. And amity is restored just in time for King Offa to die. But one of the interesting things about the Mercian legacy is the fact that in the 11th century, after the Norman invasion, if you ask people north of Watling Street what they preferred, would they have preferred the Wessex kings, the Scandinavian kings, or the Norman kings, they would probably nearly all have said, bring back the Danes. And in fact, they invite the Danes to invade north of England several times during the first years after Hastings. They didn't want to be under Wessex and they didn't want to be under the Normans. And they'd have preferred it to go back to the Danelaw by and large.
So that's a good segue into the decline of Mercia and the rise of Wessex. So is it as simple as the eclipse of Mercia is because Wessex gets more powerful, or are the two things not as connected as they sort of superficially appear?
Well, I suppose the most simplistic view is that they pass each other on the corridor. There are certainly powerful Mercian kings in the 9th century. But usually in West Saxon history, there have been two or more kings competing at the same time. So Wessex is not a unified state. Wessex's rise, it starts with Egbert, and it does coincide with slight dynastic instability in Mercia. Even so, right up until the time of the arrival of the Great Viking Army in 865, so that's 70 years after Offa's death, Mercian kings are still very powerful. There are times when Wessex has been more powerful than Mercia, and times when Mercia is more powerful than Wessex. West Saxon kings haven't conquered Mercia.
No.
They can exert overlordship. That is, at times Mercia is tributary to Wessex, but they don't really conquer it. And even the Danish conquest really only pertains up to the line of Watling Street. If you look at the Scandinavian place names in England, and if you take the Watling Street line, this continental divide between the rivers that flow northeast and the rivers that flow south and west, there are vanishingly few Danish place names south and west of Watling Street. And so, Mercian kings in the west, certainly after the Viking invasion, are controlling much less land. And we used to think, because Wessex historians, people like Asser and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicler, told us so, that after the Great Age of Mercia, Mercia was ruled by foolish kings, thanes, and really insignificant people. Well, we know that's not true, because in the aftermath of King Alfred's great victory, where he comes out of the Somerset marshes with half a dozen mates and gathers his loyal people on the downs, and then goes and beats the Danes at Eddington, we're pretty sure now that it wasn't just a West Saxon army that fought that engagement. We think now, and it's the coin evidence that's the clue, we think that there was a Mercian army there as well. And of course, bear in mind that Alfred's daughter, Athelflaed, the great Athelflaed, Alfred's half Mercian, remember? His mother's a Mercian.
Yeah.
His father is of the line of Egbert and going all the way back to, the great West Saxon dynasts of the 6th century. Alfred marries his daughter to Athelbald, who West Saxon historians called the Ealdorman of Mercia. He's the king of what's left of Mercia, really. And under Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, Edward and Athelflaed together plan this great military campaign. Some people call it the Reconquest. There's no reconquest. They plan the conquest of the Danelaw, and successfully. And Athelflaed, who becomes effectively Queen of Mercia after the death of her husband, is not only a great military leader, but she succeeds in forcing quite a few of the great Danish towns to submit to her, including Leicester, just before she dies. And it's only on her death that her daughter is smuggled away by her brother and never heard of again. And that really is the end of Mercia, because Edward the Elder subsumes it under Wessex. The Wessex narrative, which is written, of course, by the victors, likes to write the Mercians out of history. And when I wrote a book about Mercia, because I thought Mercia needed a book, a proper serious study, the reason I called it the Mercian Chronicles was an ironic term, because the Mercians kings didn't leave them a chronicle. If they did, where is it? It's gone, destroyed by the Vikings.
The West Saxons did away with it.
Well, possibly, except that, if you think of the other chronicles, it's quite difficult to round up every version of every chronicle. There's usually a smoking gun somewhere, a fragment of something. There's a bit of a fragment of a Mercian chronicle in the 9th century. It's a very small fragment. I think if there had been one, we would have known about it. If there was one, it must have been at Peterborough, and that's why it would have been lost. But why wasn't there one at Worcester? Which stays in Mercia. All the Mercian charters survive in Worcester. So why doesn't a chronicle survive? Answer: there wasn't one.
That's odd, though, in a way, isn't it? With all the religious houses and so on in Mercia, and with those being so prominent and strong, it's surprising in a way that there weren't chronicles.
It's extraordinary. I agree. It is extraordinary. We can't explain it. It's but we can get at Mercia now because of place names, because of coinage evidence, because of our much better understanding of political geography now. We're piecing this story together, and of course archaeology is also. I mean, don't forget, of course, that apart from its famous kings, Mercians built the finest Saxon standing church. I mean, Brixworth is an extraordinary building. The royal crypt at Repton, Mercian sculpture everywhere, the Lichfield Gospels. Above all, I think they built an idea of state on which the medieval English state was predicated. I think that's a Mercian. Pretty sure that's a Mercian invention or creation, and it is revolutionary in the English landscape, and it's under Mercian kings that happens. So it's a great achievement.
It seems rather as if the Wessex spin doctors have kind of claimed for Wessex some of the things that Mercia established. You mentioned the Birks earlier on, and the whole idea of organisation and so on, which much of which is credited to Alfred and his successors. They've kind of grabbed it.
Yeah, history is written by the victor. What did Churchill say? Yeah. History shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it, and he did.
He did.
And won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the thing then. So if Edward the Elder had died first rather than Athelflaed,
good question.
Would we have had Mercia as form in England rather than Wessex?
Yeah, potentially. They had Mercia has the infrastructure. Mercia is the infrastructure of the English state. Reinventing the Roman infrastructure, which was designed to get goodies out and soldiers in everywhere as quickly as possible. Ironically, of course, it's the fact that the Vikings, by virtue of being traders, knew England's navigable river system. Like in the book I wrote about King Alfred, I drew a sort of London underground map of the Viking map of their world, and essentially it reconnects the Roman road system with the navigable rivers. And the Vikings absolutely knew this when they invaded. Finally, they knew where all these interconnecting stations were. They knew where you could hop off the Piccadilly line onto the District line and get to King's Cross as quickly as possible. They knew that because they were traders, and they knew all the navigable rivers like the back of their hand. On a sort of grand mental London Underground map, and they knew which navigable rivers connected to which roads that would get them. So literally they were able to execute a blitzkrieg. Mercian kings, had they still been the strongest, would have been quick to see where they could stop that. Wessex kings being completely outside that system. It took Alfred, and he was a genius. It took him 20 years to figure out how to stop Vikings taking his landscape, and that was by construction, funnily enough, fortifications at the points where navigable rivers were crossed by roads and fords and bridges. Build a fortification. He nicked that idea off of Charlemagne's son or grandson. Somebody somewhere forgot how to defend Mercia. Bede saw this coming in the 720s, and he writes about it. He says, where this is going to end is that the kings will run out of land to give away to the church. All the people who should be defending us with their arms will become abbots and abbesses as a spurious means of escaping taxation and whatever. And lo and behold, Bede was right. 793, the Viking raid on Lindisfarne, nobody's there to defend the wealthy monasteries. They're picked off like cash machines, like bulldozing a cash machine. They're picked off one by one. That's where all the gold is. That's where all the bling is. That's where all the treasure is. That's where all the slaves are. And it's just too easy. And no king could defend them. Not until Alfred figures out his burgle system in the 880s. Very, very late in the day. The Viking wealth of the Danelaw is predicated on the wealth of the Mercian economy. Those 5 towns of the Danelaw, Nottingham, Leicester, Lincoln, Stamford, and Derby, they're merchant towns. They're merchant trading places. And part of the reason that the Vikings didn't have to despoil people is they just took over the trading. They just took over the trade. It's easier. I mean, they bashed people on the heads, of course, but it was easier to trade. So they just, in a sense, the Danelaw is the Mercian legacy, on the ground. But the Danes, they were happy to kill kings of Wessex, and they certainly would have killed Alfred if they could, but they showed no propensity to want to settle south and west of that Watling Street line. And I think it's because they always wanted to be close to a river that would take them home, across the home sea, as they called the North Sea. But, it's a riveting part of English history. Nobody's taught it at school.
Yeah,
I know. Yes,
such
exactly.
a shame. It's such a rich window, into where we come from. And everybody's still obsessed with Anglo-Saxon invasions and immigrants and all that.
You've got an encyclopedic knowledge of it.
I have actually a very poor memory for facts, but I do remember connections. And the maps in particular help me to reconnect those things that I'd forgotten about. And in fact, what I'm hoping to do, and now that I've written so many of these books about early medieval, and the final one will be the Doomsday Walking book, which will come out in September. That will be 7 books about early medieval kings, kingdoms, and life. And what I really want to do is to, after that, produce a large format, map-based companion to the early medieval period with all the genealogies, the timelines, the chronologies, but basically the maps.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, I want that book. Where do I pre-order it?
Well, I want it for myself. The maps I make are very, very big maps, and they have 80 layers of stuff going on, of coins and places and monasteries and what have you. But actually, when they come out in the book, they're tiny, and I'd like them to be available on a scale at which I can see you can see the detail, but you can also see the big picture. My map of Mercia with contours, navigable rivers, monasteries, the Roman road system, and all I've done is drawn an X. The 2 arms of the X are Watling Street and the Fosse Way. If you really want to get your head around Mercia, that's it. That X connects everything up, and everything leads from that. It connects all the rivers with the roads, and it connects all the parts of Mercia that make it a coherent state, if not a coherent group of people. So it's the maps are everything, I think.
Well, I was going to ask you what you were doing next, but it sounds as if it's the Doomsday Walking book at the moment.
Yeah, well, I spent 3 years walking around through some of the counties of England with Doomsday book as my sort of blue guide. And it's, of course, fascinating because I'm moving through England looking at landscapes which have changed in many respects. In other respects, haven't. Most of the villages that existed at the time of Doomsday still exist. The manor houses, the churches are still there. The Motte and Bailey castles are still there, largely. And it has to be done at walking pace because that is the pace at which that landscape was created over thousands of years. So it has to be done at walking pace. That's why I do it. And of course, I'm trying to see in my mind's eye a Norman landscape, a landscape of oppression, extortion, destruction, you name it. But I'm walking through the 21st century landscape, meeting my contemporaries and asking myself, what's changed, and my reflections on community and the privatization of the English landscape and the way in which travel has changed and so on up sort of throughout the book. So, of course, it's about Doomsday, but it's about us now. So I've drawn 38 maps for the Doomsday project because you have to see the map. But after Doomsday, I'm having a little break.
I'm not surprised.
I will wait for that and look out for it. And I do recommend the Mercian Chronicles. I'm still reading it at the moment and really enjoying it. And that's out in paperback. Is it this month or next month?
Well, by the time this goes out, which is a couple of weeks' time, it'll be out.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Max. It has been absolute pleasure. And please do come back to talk to us about Doomsday and the Bayeux Tapestry in September. That would be fabulous.
I'm sure I will. Nice to talk to you both.
Thank you very much, Max.
Thanks. And take care.
Bye-bye. So thank you very much to Max Adams. I do recommend you have a read of the Mercian Chronicles. It's a fabulous story, as Max has very clearly elucidated to us. Join us next time when Derek and I will be looking into the reign of Henry I. Thank you very much for listening to A Slice of Medieval. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. And remember, you can get this podcast on your favourite podcast provider, as well as on YouTube. Just search On a Slice of Medieval. Thanks for listening.